Hello everyone! Today I have another how to make style video for you, and this time it's for my ultimate sourdough sandwich bread using a Japanese method called Tangzhong. I know it's funny, but sandwich bread specifically was always difficult for me. It was either too much like a regular loaf, and then why bother making a sandwich loaf at all, or it felt too rich somehow. I'm happy to say that I finally developed a recipe that's a happy medium, and the best part about it is that it stays fresh, truly stays fresh, for up to 5 days. Before starting on the dough, we'll make tangzhong, which is essentially a thick paste made by cooking a little milk and flour together. This is the secret to why this sandwich bread is extra soft without needing a lot of fat or sugar, and it also helps the bread stay soft for longer. Be sure to mix Tangzhong mixture almost constantly over low heat. I usually start with a small whisk and switch to a kitchen spoon once it thickens. When it reaches the consistency of a thick paste, it's ready. This usually takes about 5 minutes for me. Take it off the heat and let it cool, and in the meantime, you can prepare the dough. The dough itself is probably what you'd expect for a sandwich loaf, with the exception of having a little less sugar and fat. You'll need an active sourdough starter, flour, water, some sugar, olive oil, and salt. I'm mixing up the dough directly in the bowl of my stand mixer, and while the order of ingredients you add doesn't really matter, I like to start with water and sourdough starter, mix that together, and then add all the other ingredients. I don't add the tangzhong with the other ingredients right away because it's usually not cool enough at this stage, and I don't want to accidentally kill the yeast in my starter. Instead, I turn on the stand mixer and let it mix the dough for about 5 minutes, and then I gradually add the tangzhong paste in a little at a time. But if your tangzhong paste is cool enough already when you're mixing up other ingredients, there's absolutely no harm in adding it in with the other ingredients. I have to note here that this dough is supposed to be quite wet. In my stand mixer, it doesn't fully come together into a ball even after 15 minutes of mixing. You might be tempted to add more flour, but I recommend that you don't. Instead, I usually scrape down the sides of the bowl with a dough scraper and transfer the dough to a clean bowl where I'll do about 3 rounds of stretch and folds and let it bulk ferment. Be sure to cover the dough with something to prevent it from drying out between stretch and folds. I usually do stretch and folds about every 30 minutes, starting with the first round about 30 minutes after mixing is finished. With each set of stretch and folds, the dough should become smoother, more elastic, and become easier to handle. By the final set, it shouldn't really stick to the bowl or your fingers anymore. In my house, this dough typically needs about 6 to 8 hours to do its first rise or bulk fermentation, but the exact time will depend on the temperature of your kitchen. The key signals to look for are that the dough has increased in volume by about 50%, it won't double, and if you're using a glass bowl, you should see lots of bubbles all along the edges where the dough touches the bowl. I really like using a glass bowl for bulk fermentation for this exact reason. It makes it so much easier to see how the dough is developing. After the bulk fermentation is done, transfer the dough to a floured surface and pre-shape it. Preshaping simply means gently forming the dough into a rough shape that's somewhere close to what you'll use for the final loaf. We do this because it makes the dough easier to handle when shaping it into the final loaf. I suggest waiting for about 10 to 15 minutes after pre-shaping and then do the actual shaping. Since this is going to be a sandwich loaf, we'll bake it in a 9 by 5 inch loaf pan, which I find is the perfect size for this amount of dough. To shape the loaf, I usually stretch the dough into a rough rectangle, fold both short ends over, then turn it for 80 degrees and roll it up tightly. When shaping, be careful not to use too much flour. This helps to ensure the dough sticks together properly and prevents those small swirl-like holes from forming in the crumb. If you don't have a non-stick loaf pan, I highly recommend lining it with parchment paper or greasing it lightly. For some reason, the bottom of the loaf tends to stick a bit if you skip this step. However, the top pan I'll be placing over it later to bake it covered doesn't cause any sticking issues. After shaping, you have two options. You can either let the loaf do a second rise on the counter, which means proofing it at room temperature for about 3 hours, or if it fits your schedule better, and it usually does for me, you can do a cold proof by putting the loaf in the fridge overnight or up to 24 hours. No matter the option you choose, the process that follows is the same. Score the loaf by making a deep straight line down the middle and bake it for about 40 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I like to bake it covered with another loaf pan so the top doesn't brown so much, and then uncover it for the last 10 minutes of baking. Baking it covered for a bit also traps the steam, which helps the loaf rise in the oven. I'll link the exact loaf pan I have in the description box, and I highly recommend this one because if you have two of them, you can easily almost recreate a Dutch oven environment, and that does make a difference. I'll also link the recipe with measurements down below if you want to print it out, and in case you were like me and couldn't find a sourdough sandwich loaf you really liked, I hope this one becomes a staple in your kitchen as well. As always, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below and I'll be happy to help. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos about sourdough baking, food from scratch and natural living. I upload new videos every Friday and I hope to see you soon. Bye!